Ida for refusing to help my roommate after she lost her job. I feel trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, torn between the instinct to protect my small family and the lingering loyalty I feel toward someone I once considered a sister. It's a strange, uncomfortable place to be, one where moral obligations clash violently with the harsh reality of survival. The situation I find myself in has grown increasingly unbearable, and while I've tried to rationalize my choices, I still feel conflicted about how I've handled things so far. Perhaps an outside perspective will help clear the fog in my mind. I'm 24 years old, living in a modest flat with my 5-year-old daughter, Lila. It's just the two of us. Well, it was until Amy, my roommate and longtime friend, moved in with us. Amy is 26, and we've known each other since our teenage years. Back then, life seemed simple. We bonded over school crushes, dreams of independence, and the shared desire to break free from the small-town monotony that suffocated us both. We promised we'd always have each other's backs, no matter where life took us. Our paths diverged briefly after high school. I became a mother far younger than I had planned, and the relationship with Lila's father fell apart before it ever had a chance to truly solidify. Amy, on the other hand, seemed to thrive. She got into car sales right out of college, boasting about her ability to hit commission targets and snag luxury items most people only dream of owning. Her Instagram painted a picture of success: weekend getaways, designer bags, champagne brunches. I envied her freedom, the spontaneity with which she seemed to live her life, while mine was consumed by nappies, bedtime stories, and juggling work with daycare schedules. Despite our different trajectories, Amy remained a constant presence in my life. She visited often, bringing gifts for Lila and sharing stories of her adventures. I admired her confidence, her carefree approach to life. In her, I saw a version of myself that might have existed in another timeline, one where I wasn't a single mom struggling to make ends meet. But admiration is a fragile thing, and over time, cracks began to show in the perfect image she projected. A few months ago, both Amy and I found ourselves at crossroads. I had ended a brief relationship that proved to be more draining than fulfilling, and Amy had split from her long-term boyfriend after years of on-again, off-again drama. When she suggested moving in together to split expenses, it seemed like a lifeline. We could support each other through this transitional period, share the financial burden, and perhaps recapture some of the carefree spirit of our youth. At first, it worked. Amy moved in with a seemingly endless collection of belongings, boxes upon boxes of clothes, shoes, handbags, and jewelry. Her wardrobe alone took up half the flat's storage space. She turned our little flat into something that resembled a high-end boutique. It was a far cry from the minimalist lifestyle I had adopted out of necessity. But I didn't mind. Seeing her excitement as she settled in brought a sense of normalcy and comfort to the household. Lila adored her, viewing her as the cool, fun aunt who brought a splash of color and vibrancy to our otherwise routine lives. Things were fine for a while. We navigated the shared living space with minimal friction. She had her room, I had mine. We took turns cooking, cleaning, and running errands. Amy even offered to babysit Lila on occasion, allowing me to work late shifts without the added worry of daycare fees. It felt like a mutually beneficial arrangement, a chance for both of us to rebuild and regroup after life's setbacks. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Amy lost her job in car sales a few months after moving in. She came home one day, her face pale and drawn, and announced that she'd been let go. At first, I was shocked. Amy had always been so confident in her ability to sell, to charm her way through any situation. She was the kind of person who seemed to float through life, immune to the struggles that weighed the rest of us down. But here she was, jobless and defeated. Her initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and indignation. She insisted that her dismissal wasn't her fault. She blamed her manager, calling him a power-hungry tyrant who couldn't recognize talent when it was right in front of him. She pointed fingers at the economy, claiming that the car market had taken a downturn, making it impossible to hit sales targets. She complained about unrealistic expectations imposed by higher UPS, painting herself as a victim of corporate greed and incompetence. I listened to her vent, nodding sympathetically and offering words of comfort. I knew how demoralizing it could be to lose a job. The uncertainty, the fear of what comes next, it's enough to rattle anyone. I told her things would get better, that she was resilient and capable, and that this was just a temporary setback. At the time, I believed those words. I believed she believed them too. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Amy's determination to bounce back wasn't as strong as I had assumed. Her initial drive to job hunt fizzled out alarmingly fast. The first week after her dismissal, she spent hours on her laptop, scrolling through job listings and sending out applications. But as rejection emails trickled in, her enthusiasm waned. Her laptop spent more time on the coffee table, unopened and gathering dust, while she buried herself in Netflix series, TikTok videos, and social media scrolling. Whenever I asked how her job search was going, she'd wave me off with vague answers. "It's a process," she'd say with a dismissive shrug. "I'm waiting to hear back." At first, I took her words at face value. Job hunting is a process. It takes time. But as the weeks dragged on without any significant progress, doubt began to creep in. I noticed that Amy wasn't just waiting for opportunities, she was actively avoiding them. Her days were filled with leisure, not productivity. She spent more time going out with friends than she did crafting cover letters or following up on applications. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to believe that she was doing her best, that she was simply unlucky in a difficult job market. But the reality became harder to ignore with each passing day. Our once lively conversations turned strained, tinged with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to address outright. Then came the financial strain. Amy's job loss meant she no longer had a steady income to contribute to our shared expenses. At first, she managed to cover her share of the rent using her savings. But by the third month, those savings had dried up, and she was struggling to make ends meet. I'll never forget the sinking feeling in my stomach when she casually mentioned that she couldn't cover her half of the rent that month. It was a simple statement, delivered with unnerving nonchalance. "You'll have to spot me this month," she said, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "I'll pay you back soon." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't have the luxury of brushing off financial responsibilities so easily. Every pound I earned was meticulously budgeted to ensure Lila had a stable home, healthy meals, and everything she needed to thrive. Covering Amy's rent meant dipping into my emergency savings, a fund I had painstakingly built over months to provide a safety net for my daughter and me. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Amy would pay me back once she found a new job. But deep down, I knew better. The pattern was already emerging: excuses, avoidance, and a growing sense of entitlement that I couldn't afford to indulge. Yet, despite my better judgment, I agreed to cover her share that month. I couldn't risk getting evicted or facing late fees. I made the payment, telling myself it was an act of kindness, a way to help a friend in need. But kindness has its limits, and as the situation unfolded, I began to see that my generosity was being taken for granted. Amy's behavior had settled into an alarming pattern, one that grew more frustrating and exhausting with each passing day. The woman who once oozed confidence and ambition now seemed content to drift through her days in a haze of mindless entertainment and social distractions. Every morning, I would wake early to prepare Lila for school, rushing through breakfast, packing her lunch, and ensuring she had everything she needed before heading off to work myself. Meanwhile, Amy would remain in her room, the glow of her phone or laptop casting a faint light through the cracks in her door. It became her default setting, lounging around in sweatpants, glued to a screen, completely detached from the responsibilities piling up around us. At first, I tried to be patient. I reminded myself that losing a job could be a soul-crushing experience, one that could drain even the most determined person of their drive. But the patience I clung to was quickly wearing thin as weeks turned into months and nothing changed. The job hunt, if it was even happening at all, was half-hearted at best. She spent her time binge-watching entire seasons of shows on Netflix, scrolling endlessly through TikTok, and updating her social media profiles as if the perfect selfie or witty caption would somehow conjure a new job offer out of thin air. Occasionally, she would mention that she had sent out a few applications. "It's a process," she would say, brushing off my concerns with an air of practiced dismissal. "These things take time." At first, I wanted to believe her. I even offered to help, suggesting websites to check, reviewing her CV, and encouraging her to follow up on potential leads. But every time I brought it up, the conversation would end in vague promises and little to no action. When I asked if she had any interviews lined up, she would shrug and say, "I'm waiting to hear back." There was always some excuse, some unseen hurdle that kept her from moving forward. Her lack of urgency became more concerning as bills continued to pile up. Rent was due at the start of each month, and while I had been responsible for my half since the day we moved in, Amy had started to falter. It began subtly late payments or excuses about waiting for her savings to transfer. I covered for her the first time she missed her portion, thinking it was a temporary lapse. "I'll pay you back," she promised, her tone filled with sincerity that I foolishly took at face value. But as days turned into weeks, I saw no repayment. My messages to her about the rent were often met with vague assurances or deflections. "It's coming," she'd say, or "I've got something lined up." Yet no money ever materialized. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that she was trying her best, that she wouldn't leave me hanging indefinitely. After all, Amy had been my friend for years. Friends helped each other through tough times, right? The cracks widened when rent came due again the following month. I had been dreading the conversation, hoping that she would step up and take responsibility without me having to remind her. But as the deadline loomed, I finally broached the topic, careful to keep my tone calm and non-confrontational. "Amy, rent is due tomorrow. Do you have your half ready?" Her response was like a punch to the gut. She didn't even flinch as she casually said, "You'll have to spot me again. I'll figure it out soon." The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless for a moment. There was no trace of embarrassment or shame in her tone, no acknowledgement of the burden she was placing on me. It was as if she saw my help as a given, a resource she could tap into without consequence. My heart sank as I realized that Amy wasn't taking this seriously. She wasn't scrambling to find a solution or worrying about the impact her actions were having on me and Lila. She had simply grown comfortable with the idea of me picking up the slack. I couldn't afford to keep covering for her. The rent wasn't a trivial expense I could brush off. It was a significant chunk of my income, money that I needed to ensure Lila had a safe, stable home. Covering Amy's share the previous month had already drained my emergency savings, the small cushion I had painstakingly built to safeguard against unforeseen crises. That money was meant for Lila's future, for unexpected medical bills, or repairs. It wasn't meant to subsidize someone else's carefree lifestyle. As I stood there, trying to process her nonchalant response, anger bubbled beneath the surface. I had sacrificed so much already. I had put my daughter's security at risk, dipped into funds meant to protect her, all because I believed in helping a friend in need. But this wasn't temporary assistance anymore, this was enabling. Amy wasn't desperate or struggling to make ends meet, she was taking advantage of my kindness. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before responding. "Amy, I can't keep covering your share of the rent. I'm a single mum. I have Lila to think about. This isn't just about me, it's about providing a stable life for her. I don't have the financial flexibility to keep bailing you out." Her reaction was instant and explosive. Her eyes narrowed, and her face twisted with indignation. "I thought we were friends," she snapped, her voice rising with anger. "You know I'd do this for you if the roles were reversed." I bit back the urge to argue. Would she, Though, would Amy really have done the same for me, or was that just another excuse to justify her behavior? The truth was, I couldn't imagine her making the same sacrifices I had made. Amy had always been independent, yes, but she had also lived a life of relative privilege. Her parents had money, her lifestyle choices were often extravagant, and she had never truly faced the harsh realities of scraping by. "I'm not trying to be heartless," I said, keeping my tone measured despite the tension building between us. "But I have to prioritize Lila's well-being. I'm working full-time to keep a roof over our heads, and every penny I earn goes toward that goal. Dipping into my savings to cover your rent isn't sustainable. You need to figure something out, whether it's borrowing money from your parents, selling some of your luxury items, or moving back home." "But I can't keep doing this." Amy's expression hardened. "I can't believe you are turning your back on me. After everything we've been through." Her words stung more than I cared to admit. I did feel guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for saying no to someone I once considered family. But that guilt was overshadowed by the overwhelming need to protect my daughter. Lila depended on me. I couldn't afford to let my loyalty to Amy jeopardize the stability and security I had worked so hard to build. Amy stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the flat, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Had I been too harsh? Too cold? Or was this simply a necessary step to reclaim control over my life? As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about rent. It was about a friendship that had slowly unraveled, revealing cracks that had been there all along. Amy wasn't the same person I had grown up with. She had changed, or maybe I had changed. Either way, the bond we once shared had become a liability, a source of stress and resentment. I thought of Lila, her bright smile and innocent laughter. She deserved a home free from tension and financial instability. She deserved a mother who could provide for her without constantly worrying about covering someone else's expenses. And so, despite the lingering pangs of guilt, I made a decision. I would no longer enable Amy's behavior. The time for excuses had passed. For too long, I had carried the burden of someone else's choices. It was time to put my daughter and myself first. I took a deep breath before saying the words I knew she didn't want to hear, but they had been building inside me for weeks, maybe even months. "Amy, I can't keep covering your share of the rent." I kept my voice calm, measured, even though inside I was teetering between frustration and exhaustion. "This isn't just about me. It's about Lila. I'm a single mom, working full-time to provide for her, and every penny I make goes toward keeping a roof over our heads, food on the table, and making sure she's happy and healthy." The words felt heavier as they came out of my mouth. They weren't just statements, they were facts. My life revolved around my daughter's well-being, and every decision I made, every sacrifice, was to ensure she had a stable and secure future. There was no room for financial recklessness, no room for indulgent spending or luxury comforts. I had been meticulous in managing our household budget, making sure that I could stretch every pound as far as possible. And now, that delicate balance was crumbling because of Amy's irresponsibility. She sat across from me on the couch, arms crossed over her chest, lips pursed into a thin, stubborn line. Her reaction was defensive before I even finished speaking, and I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. But I pressed on, refusing to let the tension in the room derail what needed to be said. "Covering your rent last month," I continued, "meant dipping into the small savings I've set aside for emergencies and for Lila's future. That money is supposed to be a safety net. It's not meant to cover someone else's expenses." I could feel my voice trembling slightly as I said it, the weight of my own sacrifices pressing down on me like a heavy burden. "I can't keep doing this without jeopardizing our stability." Amy shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting to the floor. For a moment, I thought maybe my words were getting through to her. Maybe she understood the gravity of the situation, the real consequences of her actions. But then, she sighed dramatically and threw her hands up in exasperation. "I told you," she said, her tone laced with frustration. "I'm trying. I'm applying for jobs. It's just not that easy right now. The job market is terrible. Everyone's struggling. You think I want to be in this position?" Her words were like a slap in the face. The implication that I somehow didn't understand struggle was absurd. I had been struggling for years, juggling work, motherhood, and the never-ending pressure to keep everything afloat on my own. I knew exactly what it meant to fight for survival. The difference was that I did fight. Every day, I fought to make sure Lila was taken care of. I didn't have the luxury of sitting around, waiting for things to magically improve. I didn't have time for excuses. "It's not about what you want," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing frustration. "It's about what you're doing, or, rather, what you're not doing." "I get it, Amy. The job market is tough. But you're not even trying anymore. You're spending your days watching Netflix and scrolling through TikTok. You go out with friends more often than you apply for jobs. And meanwhile, I'm the one left picking up the pieces." Her face hardened, her posture stiffening as if she was preparing for a fight. "You think I'm just sitting around doing nothing? That's not fair, isn't it?" I asked, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. And while you're sitting here, acting like everything's fine, I'm the one worrying about how we're going to make rent, how I'm going to pay for Lila's school supplies, how I'm going to stretch my paycheck to cover everything. I'm not just responsible for myself. I have a child to think about. And I won't jeopardize her stability because you refuse to take responsibility for your own life." The room fell into a tense silence. Amy stared at me, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process the fact that I was finally standing my ground. I could see the gears turning in her mind, searching for a way to deflect, to shift the blame, to make me feel guilty for drawing a line. "You know," she finally said, her voice cold and cutting, "I thought we were friends. I thought you'd have my back, especially after everything we've been through." I felt the sting of her words, but I refused to let them sway me. This wasn't about friendship. It was about survival. "We are friends," I said quietly, "but friendship doesn't mean enabling someone to make reckless choices. Friendship doesn't mean sacrificing my daughter's future for someone who refuses to take accountability." Amy's eyes narrowed, and I could see the walls going up. She wasn't hearing me anymore. She was focused on her own narrative, the one where she was the victim, and I was the villain. "You wouldn't be in this position if the roles were reversed," she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I'd help you without hesitation. Would you?" I asked, meeting her gaze. "Because honestly, Amy, I don't think you would. You've never been in my position. You've never had to sacrifice everything for someone else. You've always had a safety net: your parents, your savings, your lifestyle. This is the first time you are facing real consequences, and instead of dealing with them, you're expecting me to fix it for you." Her face reddened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I can't believe you are turning your back on me." "I'm not turning my back on you," I said firmly. "But I have to draw the line somewhere. I have to put Lila first. I'm her mother. She depends on me. And if I keep covering your expenses, I'm putting her at risk. I won't do that." Amy stood abruptly, the tension radiating off her in waves. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll figure it out on my own." I watched as she stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the flat, reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat of finality. I sat there in the aftermath, the silence heavy and suffocating. My hands trembled slightly as I ran them through my hair, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me. Had I been too harsh? Too unkind? The guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to second-guess myself. I had to protect my daughter, even if it meant losing a friendship that had once been so important to me. As the evening wore on, the flat remained eerily quiet. I went through the motions of my routine, making dinner, helping Lila with her homework, tucking her into bed, but my mind kept drifting back to Amy. I wondered what she was doing behind that closed door. Was she packing her things? Planning her next move? Or was she sitting there, stewing in anger, convinced that I was the villain in her story? I tried to shake off the thoughts. This wasn't about Amy anymore. It was about Lila. It was about making sure my daughter had a stable, secure home. It was about drawing boundaries and refusing to let someone else's irresponsibility derail the life I was building for us. The next morning, when I woke early to prepare breakfast and get Lila ready for school, Amy's door remained shut. I paused outside it for a moment, debating whether to knock, but ultimately decided against it. She needed to figure things out for herself. I couldn't keep holding her hand. As I walked Lila to school, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had done what I needed to do. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't painless, but it was necessary. Sometimes, protecting what matters most means making hard choices. And for me, that meant putting my daughter first always. Amy's outburst lingered in my mind long after she stormed off to her room, slamming the door with a force that shook the walls. I stood there in the silence, staring at the closed door, feeling a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and guilt swirling inside me. The guilt was the worst part, the nagging voice in my head telling me that maybe I had been too harsh, too quick to draw a line in the sand. After all, we had been friends for years. We had shared secrets, milestones, heartbreaks. Could I really turn my back on someone who had once been such a big part of my life? But then, another voice cut through the guilt, a quieter, calmer voice, one that reminded me why I had to stand firm. I glanced down the hall, where Lila's drawings covered the fridge, her little backpack hung on a hook by the door, and her favorite stuffed animal sat perched on the couch. This wasn't just about me. This was about her. Every decision I made impacted her future, her security, her happiness. Lila depended on me in ways Amy never would, and my responsibility to her came before anything else. I sat down at the kitchen table, resting my head in my hands, trying to process the events of the past few weeks. Amy's words echoed in my head. I thought we were friends. You know I'd do this for you if the roles were reversed. But would she? I found myself questioning that claim more and more. If the roles really were reversed, would Amy dip into her savings to cover my rent, putting her own future at risk for me? Would she sacrifice her financial stability, her child's security, for someone else's comfort? The answer, I realized, was no. Amy had never been in a position where she had to make those kinds of sacrifices. She had always had options: her parents' support, her savings, her ability to coast through life without facing real hardship. Even now, with her job loss, she had choices. She could sell her designer bags and shoes, items that could easily cover a couple of months' rent. She could ask her parents for help or move back home to save money. But she wasn't willing to take those steps. Instead, she expected me to shoulder the burden, to keep making sacrifices so she wouldn't have to. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I wasn't being heartless. I wasn't abandoning a friend in need. I was setting a boundary, a necessary one, to protect my daughter and myself from a situation that had become unsustainable. I had already done more than enough. Covering Amy's rent once had been an act of kindness, but kindness had its limits. It wasn't my job to save her from the consequences of her own inaction. The next few days passed in tense silence. Amy stayed in her room most of the time, only emerging to grab something from the kitchen or head out to meet friends. She barely acknowledged me, her coldness palpable. At first, I tried to make peace, offering polite conversation when we crossed paths, but she brushed me off with curt replies or stony silence. It was clear she was angry, and I wasn't sure if she would ever get over it. Meanwhile, I carried on with my routine work, taking care of Lila, keeping the flat running smoothly. I didn't have the luxury of wallowing in guilt or regret. There were bills to pay, meals to cook, and a little girl who needed my attention and love. I focused on what mattered most, providing stability for Lila, ensuring she felt safe and happy, despite the tension hanging in the air. But the standoff couldn't last forever. The rent deadline came and went, and once again, Amy failed to contribute her share. I paid the full amount, using what little remained of my emergency savings, knowing that this was the last time I could afford to do so. The financial strain was becoming unbearable, and I couldn't keep covering for her without jeopardizing our future. That evening, after Lila was asleep, I knocked on Amy's door. She opened it slowly, her expression guarded. I could see that she had been crying, her eyes red and puffy, but her posture remained defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. She stepped aside, letting me into her room. The space was cluttered with clothes, handbags, and shoes, luxury items that could have easily paid for several months' rent if she chose to sell them. The contrast between her lifestyle and the reality of our situation was jarring, and it solidified my resolve. "I paid the rent," I began, "but that's the last time I can do it. I can't afford to keep covering for you." Amy sat on the edge of her bed, avoiding my gaze. "I'm trying," she mumbled, but the words sounded hollow. "I know you've been struggling," I continued, "and I'm sorry you're going through a tough time. But I have to put my daughter first. Lila depends on me to provide for her, to keep a roof over our heads. Every time I cover your rent, I'm taking money away from her future, from her stability. I can't keep doing that." Amy finally looked up, her expression softening slightly. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I didn't know what else to do." "There are things you can do," I said gently. "You can sell some of your things. You can ask your parents for help. You can move back home if you need to. There are options. But expecting me to keep bailing you out isn't one of them." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. For a moment, I wondered if this was the end of our friendship, if this conversation would be the final nail in the coffin. But then, Amy nodded slowly, a hint of understanding in her eyes. "I'll figure something out," she said quietly. "I'll start selling some stuff. And maybe it's time for me to move back home." Relief washed over me, mixed with sadness. It wasn't the outcome I had hoped for when we first decided to live together, but it was the right one. Sometimes, friendships evolve. Sometimes, they change in ways we don't expect. And sometimes, the best way to support someone is by letting them face their own challenges head on. Over the next week, Amy began packing her things. She listed some of her designer items online and made arrangements to move back in with her parents. The tension between us eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There were no dramatic apologies or heartfelt goodbyes. But when the day came for her to leave, she gave me a long hug at the door. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Take care of yourself." As she walked away, I closed the door behind her, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a newfound sense of clarity. Life would be quieter without Amy, but it would also be more stable. And that's what mattered most. Later that night, as I tucked Lila into bed, she looked up at me with her bright, curious eyes. "Is Aunt Amy coming back?" I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetie. But she'll be okay. And so will we. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Protecting what mattered most. Ensuring my daughter had the stability, love, and security she deserved." And knowing that sometimes, setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it's an act of self-preservation. So, Reddit, Ida for refusing to help Amy anymore? No. I don't think I am.